Hello and welcome to a lecture series that I'm calling Intro to Consequentialist Lornography. We'll be taking a look at the Church of Cod and others' treatment of Lorne Armstrong, the prolific sex offender, who was featured on an episode of To Catch a Predator back almost, I think, more than a decade ago at this point. We're basically going to be looking at whether or not it's morally permissible for the members of the Church of Cod to be treating Lorne the way they do. We'll get deeper and look at maybe some yes arguments, some no arguments, and ultimately try to draw some sort of a conclusion about whether it's permissible and whether or not there's a benefit, perhaps a benefit to Lorne, or perhaps a benefit to society, or maybe the church members themselves, but we'll get into it. This part of the lecture series is part one. As you can see, the overview of the concepts. So what we're going to be doing is looking into some of the legal theories behind punishment, and when it's acceptable, how much is acceptable, why it's acceptable, if it's ever acceptable. We'll get into all of that stuff and try to come away with a better understanding of what's going on with Lorne and how all right it is. There he is, the man himself. He never meant to do it. Keep that in mind. That's going to come into play later. I think that's that argument that he makes is more important than I think some people maybe give it credit for. So, first we're going to get into, very simply, broad overview, what punishment is. We'll try to come up with a little bit of a definition for our own purposes for this series, with some sort of, I guess you could say, academic concepts. So, regardless of what eventually we'll get into the permissibility of the particular punishments levied at Lorne, including outliers, but we're going to avoid the outliers till the end because they can make things a little tough to get a general understanding. But we'll cover it for sure, and include them in counter arguments eventually, perhaps when the arguments get a little more sophisticated. So first off, regardless of permissibility, punishment involves an infliction of burden. Very right off the bat, simple. Prison. The burden is you have lost your freedom. Another example would be the sex offender registry. Similar, you lose freedom, not quite as much as going to prison. You have to report, depending on the state, sometimes 4 times a year, with what you're doing for a living, where you live, what kind of cars you drive, where you've traveled, where you're planning on traveling, all kinds of stuff like that. Family members. Sorry about that. So the second thing that it requires for our purposes here is that it's got to be an intentional infliction of burden, or intended. So taxes wouldn't really count in our concept, even though they are a burden. They're not intended to be a burden. Another example would be childbirth, which is literally referred to as labor, going into labor, but it's not an intended burden. The intention there, in the case of childbirth, would be giving birth to a new life, procreation, continuing on the human race. And in the case of taxes, obviously, hopefully, it would be to run a state efficiently and help its citizens. But that's a conversation for another time. And the last requirement for our purposes is that it's imposed on a guilty person in response to an offense. This kind of would help us rule out a big thing that people talk about now is civil forfeiture. And even though that is basically a punishment, it's not in the sense that we're thinking of. Civil forfeiture, for those of you who do not know, is let's say you live in a house with someone who's a drug dealer and they're arrested. The police can confiscate your property because of your relation to that person. So you could either look at it as that's still a punishment, you're punished for your association, whether you knew about their offenses or not. Or you could say it's not a punishment, that you're being victimized by the justice system. That's what some people say. But for our purposes, it's going to require imposition on a guilty person in response to their perceived offense. And in our very specific case with Lorne, it's his conviction as a sex offender, particularly of children, towards children. So, in summation there, the definition that we're getting is an imposition of intended burdens that express social condemnation on people believed to be guilty of crimes for said crimes. So, ultimately, with bringing that into the permissibility part, it's treating someone in a way that would be otherwise morally impermissible if they obviously had not committed whatever crime or social wrong. And then we're going to get into our argument as to, I guess, the moral permissibility, why we might find it morally permissible to do what I don't want to say I'll say that the Church of God does what it does, because it's trying to look at this somewhat objectively and abstractly. So for our uses, we're going to be looking at consequentialist arguments in favor of punishments. So first of all, consequentialism, it contrasts with more punitive measures of punishment, in that it's not so much about directly punishing someone for something they've done in the past, but it's about preventing bad things from happening. So the right, it involves determining the morality of an action by looking at its outcome. So in our specific case, Lorne, the morality of what would the outcome be of exposing yourself to a 12-year-old child, and I think we know more or less what that would be. And also we can start thinking about, for later on, what the outcome of the Church of God's treatment of Lorne is, which I'm not going to get too into it right now, but just kind of think about that. So moving forward, that kind of, you get an immediate contradiction where, well, the punishment is a wrong because it's a negative thing, the negative outcome on the person, they're losing their freedom or whatever it may be. But Bentham sort of covered this in the 1700s and said these are punishments are necessary evils because they, the social benefit, the net benefit, ends up outweighing that temporary negative on that individual who has presumably infringed on someone else's autonomy in order to commit their crime. So they've already sort of sacrificed their rights, some of their rights. And then that gets very deep into legal theory, and we will cover that later on. But Bentham had that basic explanation as to why it was okay to punish people, even though it is a negative, and you're trying to avoid negatives ultimately with punishments. It seems kind of obvious if you're just thinking about it in layman's terms. It's like, yeah, well, you punish people if they do something wrong, so you can stop them from doing wrong things. But ultimately, the end goal here is to reduce crime. It's not to punish somebody and make them feel bad in a punitive manner. It's pretty specifically to punish future crime from occurring. And there are three different kind of subsections that you can look at, and we'll go over them very briefly. Again, this is just an overview of concepts. The first one being deterrence. It's sort of obvious. It's a criminal fears punishment so they don't break the law. Old school example in some countries, they say if you're a thief, we'll cut off your hands. So people fear losing their hands so they don't steal. That's how it's thought to work. That's the intention there. The second two are bigger for us, I think, when it comes to Lorne, since he's already done what he's done. But he might do it again in the future. We don't want that to happen. Incapacitation, I think, is the biggest that applies to the way the Church of God treats him and their role in this whole thing. It's not so much used to dissuade somebody. It's the goal here is to remove them from a situation, remove a criminal from a situation in which they're tempted to commit the crime. And very briefly, we'll get into this deeper later, but with Lorne, the more awareness that is drawn to his true nature, the less likely he's going to be able to victimize a woman, whether she be underage or not. And thirdly, offender reform, which, depending on how you look at it or who you ask, some people think it's impossible with Lorne. The goal here, it's sort of like deterrence, but it's not quite as prudential. You're attempting to reshape the morals and the motives and the dispositions and the outlooks of the offender in order to change their future choices and therefore actions. I don't know how possible that is with Lorne. But it does seem to me, especially with some of the stuff with the therapist and some of the Q&As and whatnot, that maybe they were starting to help him look at it in a different way and perhaps see some of his guilt. But we'll get into why I'm very skeptical of that later on. Now we'll look at, very briefly, again, this is an introduction of concepts, so I don't want anyone to think that I'm brushing any of these counter-arguments off. But these are some general counter-arguments that are used against these consequentialist arguments. One is efficacy, and it's saying, well, how effective is it? Obviously. It's asking, well, certain X% of people are recidivists, which means they'll commit the crime again even though they've been punished, so how much does it really work? That's more looking at social statistics and criminology statistics, where you're saying, oh, well, on average, it doesn't work for everybody, but it works for some people. Some people go to jail once and I don't want to go back there. And again, that I don't think it has quite as much to do with what we're looking at. With the incapacitation, because incapacitation is essentially always effective. It's just the questions start coming in, as you'll see later, with the severities and whatnot. But with efficacy, if you're actively preventing somebody from doing the thing you don't want them to do, it's going to work. It's just, again, varying degrees of appropriateness. In the 1970s, there was sort of this nihilistic look, which was that the nothing works approach. Like, certain people will always break the law, no matter how much you punish them. There's basically no way to stop them. That's kind of died off recently, as maybe with punishment, some people still believe that, but most people believe that criminals in some way, shape, or form can be reformed, I guess, these days. I don't know if I do. The incapacitations relation, so this one gets into incapacitation, which is good, but it more applies to things like drug dealers. So if you incapacitate someone who's a drug dealer, the likelihood that someone's going to fill in that gap the next day, essentially, or possibly that day, is very high. You're not going to stop selling drugs just by putting people in jail, because there's always going to be more people to sell drugs because they're going to want to make money. With sex crimes, a little different. There's not the supply and the demand. It's not a commodity. It's not a good. Excuse me. Right. So the incapacitation, I think, works better in these senses of sex offenders, whereas when it's selling something illegal, it doesn't. It's not quite as effective. But again, we'll get into these kind of arguments more in detail later on. The justification of cost here, it's a very obvious argument in that if you're spending a lot of money trying to prevent a crime that doesn't actually cost a lot of money and doesn't actually hurt any individual people, like bike theft, if you were spending more money to stop bike thieves than the bikes themselves cost, perhaps that would be a good argument against the punishment itself. Or incarcerating said bike thieves, I guess you could say. Doesn't apply here because the Church of God is doing it, because they want to. There's no real cost. It's maybe on the individual level, some people are spending too much time on it, but whatever. If it's what you're interested in, do what you got to do, as long as you're not full on breaking the law. Potential punishment of innocence. Obviously a concern that could be brought up in an academic concept here. I don't think there's any real question, but we'll look at it in a little more depth later for the, again, academic interest of it. The severity of the punishment. Now that does obviously come into question, particularly when we get into the portion that will come later on, the outliers, because some people obviously took it too far, and whether or not you can even consider what they were doing punishment becomes called into question. But yeah, so in a real world example, I guess you could say, go back to the cutting off of the hands. And the problem that a lot of people have with the consequentialist argument is because it says do whatever it takes for the most part to stop somebody from committing a crime or breaking the law or harming society. Where do you draw the line of the severity? Because you could stop somebody from, for example, if usury was illegal in your society, you could stop somebody from committing usury by killing them. But yeah, it's 100% effective. But is it too severe? Obviously, most people are going to say yes. It's pretty much too severe. But again, with this situation, it's going to have to do more with the outliers, and we'll get into that. And then the obligatory Kant reference, where you can't use a human life as the means to an end, and if the end is preventing crime, you can't use the human to do that. My very simple argument is that Lorne in particular sacrificed or gave up his right to that sort of treatment when he tried to use a child as the means to his own sexual end, because what are you supposed to do there? Let him do it again and not punish him, or they're obviously, it's not just a valuable social end, which is stopping the future molestation of children. It's also, there's a reformative aspect for Lorne himself, so that's another good way to, I think, get around that. But again, we'll get more in depth in that with the counter-arguments sort of particular slide series. And then finally, we're going to have Lorne here. Just briefly, things to think about going when we go forward here about him. He's unrepentant. I think that's pretty clear. He's unreformed. Most recent we know of him, he's still trying to date the decoy in one way or another. And I know people are, oh, that's not, be more specific, because it makes it sound like he might be trying to date a child. I don't really care. That's what he's trying to do. From what I understand, he was under the impression that she was quite a mess, was in sex rehab, and he decided to have sexual conversations with her over the phone or via text message, whatever it was, while she was in sex rehab. So I don't think he's reformed. I think he's still sexual predator, pretty clearly taking advantage of whether it be children or what he perceives to be or knows to be someone who is sick. In this case, has a sex addiction and has to go to rehab for it. He sees, this is very clear, he sees external factors as potentially justificatory. My mom, I never got my mac and cheese. So, he's all about that. Anything he can come up with that would, I wasn't in my right head state of mind. Ridiculous arguments that he'll make that try to justify him, and they don't even hold up, because he tries to say, I was depressed and I wasn't in my right state of mind. And I can almost 100%, with 100% certainty, say that depressed people do not show their penises to little children and come up with pet names and show joy. And the way he was acting in those conversations and web chats and all those things, it's a poor excuse. I'm surprised he thought that would work. It would work on anybody who hadn't read the chat log like himself. So maybe he was able to fool himself because he hasn't sat down and actually read that thing. And finally, he does not take responsibility for what occurs. Like, it kind of goes back to what we were just saying before. The sting just kind of happened to him. The best you're going to get in that one apology video he did, he said, I apologize for my involvement in the sting. Which, if you didn't know any better and you just watched that video, you would think he was some kid fresh out of college, really eager to get into journalism, and he signed up as an intern and was helping bust these predators, and he felt a little bad about the tactics, so he was apologizing for that. Obviously, we know that's not the case. And I would like to point out that in that video, he spends more time promoting his music than he does actually addressing what happened, which was that he tried to basically have sex with a 12, 13-year-old girl who had the disposition of basically an 8-year-old. And that, so, I mean, it's up to you guys. This one is the way I perceive it slide, but I think I have some pretty solid evidence to suggest these 4 claims that you see up here. And again, guys, this was an overview of concepts, intro to this whole thing will be the intro to consequentialist lornography, but this part 1 was an overview of concepts. Later, we're going to be getting more into incapacitation and offender reform, specifically in the context of Lorne and lornography and the community. We're going to look more at these counter-arguments, because if we're going to try to build an argument that states it's okay for us to continue to involve ourselves in Lorne's life, or for the church to continue to involve itself in Lorne's life the way it does, and hopefully, really a goal here, and the goal with any theory would be to have, I would hope, real-world application, and it's to draw a line and say, well, where does the line get crossed, and what is permissible and what isn't. I think we all have a gut instinct, but it would be nice to try to solidify something, and you could probably take this and apply it to a lot of sort of online trolling, where you look at the severity of what the individual did, and you compare that to his treatment. So I think a really quick, very brief example, Chris Chandler, hard to justify some of the treatment that they've received. I mean, unless you're Michael Snyder, it's pretty hard to justify it. So there's the sources, guys. I know that's kind of tiny. I'll put them in the description as well. But these are just things that I read, kind of researching. And these will also pop up more later. I'll just have this at the end of every slide, pretty much, unless I add new sources in. But this is the stuff that I was using to research permissibility of punishments. So hopefully you guys learned something here, maybe even enjoyed it, go ahead, please leave a comment if you have any disagreements. But do keep in mind we're going to get more into depth with some of this stuff. So anything that you might be interested in seeing covered, I would appreciate that. Leave a like and a comment, as they say. Subscribe if you want to get notified for the next one, which should be coming out, I'm hoping, sometime next week. I'm away this weekend, but I'll do some reading and research. I'm interested in really getting into the, with Lorne, the sort of, what is the outcome of his treatment by the community. I think that's going to be a big part of the argument that we end up building. So we'll get into some of that stuff, guys. Again, thanks for listening. Have a great day. Oh, and happy Lorne. I guess I should, that's pretty important, huh? Happy Lorne.